This is Lemmy with RevZilla TV, here to talk to you today about how to change your motorcycle oil. For most riders, changing your oil is the maintenance task second only to checking tire pressure that you're going to perform most frequently. Instead of spending lots and lots of money paying somebody else to do it, you can spend a little quality time with your bike, learn a little bit about it, and make sure the job's getting done right by doing it yourself. This guide is here to help you do that. So as you can see here to my left, we have the 2013 Street Glide. This is going to serve as our representative example. Now you can see we have this thing up on a lift. It's not necessary. It's really just to make your view a little bit better and make life easier on our camera operator. You can do this thing laying on the ground. That's where I do most of my oil changes. Putting the bike in the air is not really necessary. So the Street Glide is going to be a representative motorcycle. There's a wide variety of motorcycles out there, and there's a lot of different ways to change oil. What we're going to show you is sort of a general theory and overview about getting the oil out of the bike, getting fresh oil into the bike, and getting your filter on and off. But just keep in mind, what you see here may not be exactly like your motorcycle. The next item we're going to talk about besides the bike is the tools you're going to need for this job. Now what you're looking at over here to my right is simply a collection of tools that we're going to use for this oil change. But again, because all bikes differ a little bit, not all tools are going to be the same. However, there are some basics just about everybody's going to wind up having. Let's run through some stuff. First things first, you're going to need some method of getting your oil filter off. Now if you have an external spin-on filter, a set of filter jaw pliers like these will definitely be helpful. However, if you have an internal filter, you may not need that. You may just need something as simple as an Allen key. You can see here we do have a Zlogger handy. Make sure if you're in the garage, you're enjoying your time there. I like to suck down a couple beers while I'm working on my bike, and I'm guessing most of you are no different. You can see latex gloves. Now I'm not a big clean freak, nor am I a big safety guy. However, motor oil, especially used motor oil, is carcinogenic. Protect yourself. I put plenty of carcinogens into myself. I don't need any extra help. We have our filter, we have our oil, we do have a funnel, we have a plastic bag, the purpose of which I'll explain to you just a little bit later, and of course a drain pan, because you do want to capture that used motor oil. It's pretty harmful for the environment. Recycling it is not difficult at all if you're in North America. So what I don't have on the workbench is a factory service manual. I've done thousands of oil changes and I feel pretty confident I can get through this one without a manual. But there's no shame in terms of having a manual on your bench. Oftentimes when I'm doing more complex projects, I'll have 3 or 4 separate manuals opened up and maybe even a tablet computer pulled up with a forum so I can gain additional information. Knowledge is the most important tool. Don't be afraid of using it. Which brings us to difficulty. Most oil changes are fairly easy on today's motorcycles. There are 1 out of 3 beards on our BSD, or Beard Scale of Difficulty. All of you should be able to get an oil change performed. And again, it's going to bring you a little closer to your bike. You're going to get to spend a little bit of quality time with your best friend, and you're going to possibly spot problems before they crop up. Let's get right into things. The first step I like to do when I'm doing an oil change is actually to check the oil. I like to see the level of it. Low oil can do a variety of things. Firstly, the engine tends to run a little bit hotter. Oil serves as a cooling agent in most motorcycles. The other thing oil is responsible for is lubricating the engine, obviously. On something like a Harley, it can be damaging to the engine if you're running low. But if you're on a metric bike, say, the oil performs a couple more functions. Many metric bikes use the engine oil also as a transmission lubricant, and it serves a tertiary function of actually cooling off the stator, which is an electrical component. Some bikes are famous for having stators go bad a little bit early because they've been run low on oil. So if I see a bike that's been run low on oil, I know I can keep an eye out for some other damage that may have occurred. The other reason I like to check the oil too is because I like to actually examine the consistency of it. Sometimes there's things in the oil that can tell you about bad things that are happening in your engine. For instance, if your engine oil was to look milky, that can sometimes mean that coolant is getting into your oil. Now that's not going to happen, of course, on an air-cooled Harley, but if you do have a liquid-cooled bike and you have milky oil, that can be indicative of coolant mixing with the oil, which is not a good situation. The other thing you can sometimes see too are metallic flakes. The oil will look sparkly when you're looking at it. Sparkly oil can also be a sign that maybe there is some metal-to-metal friction that shouldn't be happening in there. Now, while these are bad things to see, if you catch them early enough, you can sometimes save yourself from having to purchase, say, a replacement engine. I know I've definitely replaced cases on Harleys before, and sometimes those problems could have been caught earlier had somebody been paying a little attention to the fluid, to the obvious signs of damage that were occurring. Even though your factory service manual may not tell you to check the level and condition of your oil as part of an oil change, I think there's some benefits, as you can see. Let's get this dipstick out of here and take a peek. We're going to check the dipstick on this particular bike, but remember, not every single motorcycle, yours included, will have a dipstick necessarily. Some bikes have sight glasses, in which you'll actually have to check the level by peering into a glass on the side of the engine. Also remember, the position of the bike is important as far as determining the correct oil level. Because the oil flows to the bottom of its tank, you may or may not have to check the bike upright or in its side stand. Your manual is going to tell you how to do it, and really you should know how to check your oil. It's something every motorcyclist should be doing regularly. So as you can see here, this particular oil is not too bad. I don't see any metallic flakes, and I certainly don't see any milkiness. That's a good sign. I also see a proper level on here. This is a good start to an oil change. At this point, what I like to do with the dipstick, if the bike has one, is leave it just sort of hanging out of the engine. This is a sign most mechanics will use to let other mechanics know not to start a motorcycle because it's being operated on. We're going to do that, and then at this point, it's time to get the old motor oil out of this bike. So we're under the belly of the beast. It's time now to get the drain plug out of the bike so we can get the oil out. Before we get to that, let's discuss a couple tips and tricks, again, that might make your life just a little bit easier. First things first, make sure the plug you're about to pull is indeed the oil drain plug. Some bikes have a number of plugs underneath, like this Street Glide here. There's a transmission oil drain plug. There's also, off to the side, a primary oil plug. If you don't pull the correct drain plug, the oil drain plug, you may wind up doing just a bit more than an oil change. The next tip I have for you too is you can see off camera here we have our oil drain pan. What you can't see is inside the drain pan I have a sacrificial rag placed in there. This rag's going to get dirty and disgusting, but what the rag does is for the initial deluge of oil that winds up pouring in there, it sort of helps dampen that so the oil doesn't go into the pan and jump right back out. This will keep things clean. It'll keep our work area clean and kind of minimize some of the cleanup we're going to wind up doing at the end of the oil change. So let's get right to it. This particular bike uses a 5/8 inch socket to get the drain plug off. So as you can see here, I'm getting onto this plug. Now the first thing you're going to do is break this thing free. Almost always, the initial pull on a drain plug is kind of difficult. After that, it should unthread pretty easily. So as you can see here, I'm going to put a little bit of oomph to it, and I just felt it kind of break free. So from here, I'm going to spin this thing out slowly, and as it gets to the end of its travel, you may even be able to use your fingers to get the drain plug finally loose and get this thing coming out. You'll know you're nearing the end of the travel when you see the threads from the drain plug start weeping a little bit. Now I can feel this loosening up. I don't think we're at finger loose yet, but we're definitely getting there. I'm going to take a peek in just a moment to see exactly how loose we are. At the moment I do see oil starting to form on the threads. I'm going to move that drain pan into position real quickly, and then you're going to wind up seeing basically a deluge of oil come out when the plug breaks free. The plug might pop into the pan, which isn't the biggest deal in the world. Just make sure if it does wind up in the pan that you remember to go back and get it before you dump your oil. So let's keep getting this thing out. I think we might be at finger loose at this point. So at this juncture, the drain plug feels very finger loose. I suspect that there is probably a whole bunch of oil about to shoot out of here. So what I'm going to do to deal with this is for the last few turns, I'm going to simultaneously spin them out with my left hand, and then I'm also going to drag my oil pan in underneath. As you can see, it is draining right now. We're going to wait until this drains completely. Wait till you see nothing. This is going to slow to a trickle, and then eventually you'll see absolutely nothing coming out of your oil pan. While that's happening, let's move to the filter removal. So we're back top side of the bike. At this point, it's time to swap oil filters. Now removing the old filter is going to differ from bike to bike, as we had talked about earlier. Some of you are going to have an internal filter. If you do, when you're removing the access plate, be careful when you're getting the last of the bolts undone, because those things are under spring pressure. It's not enough to be dangerous, but it is enough to throw some parts out into your lap. You don't want that because you want to see exactly how the order those parts came out in. So again, just be mindful of the fact there are some little parts in there, and make sure you're taking everything out and returning it in the proper order. Now for those of you who are working on something with an external filter, you're going to need to basically spin that filter off. Sometimes that can be pretty difficult. As we had mentioned earlier, there are a variety of tools around to help get the filter off. Some tools are helpful in certain situations and some tools are not. So you may need one or two different cracks at it with different tools, seeing about getting that filter off there. As you can see here, I have my filter jaw pliers handy. So what I'm going to do is get these around the filter, and I'm going to start cranking down. Now the first couple cranks are going to be difficult because you have to loosen it up, much like the drain plug itself. So as you can see here, I'm breaking this thing free. Now I have this thing finger loose. Remember before we talked about that plastic bag? Now's the time when you would be using it. One of the things you can do to help keep your mess from being to be minimal is to take your plastic bag, slide it over the filter or up if you have a low-hanging filter, and you can actually envelop the filter with the bag. From there, you should be able to loosen the filter in the bag to help keep the mess down. Now, I'm not going to do that on this particular oil change because I want you guys to see exactly what I'm doing with my hands as far as filter removal is concerned. Just keep in mind, much like the drain plug, this thing is going to give you just a little shot of oil. So make sure you have a pan underneath handy or some rags if you're not going to use the plastic bag trick. So we've got this filter busted loose. I can now spin this thing off by hand as you're seeing me do at the moment. There's our little shot of oil we discussed coming out, which you would trap with your plastic bag. Couple more spins and I'm now free of the motorcycle with this filter. Let's get over to the bench and do a little bit of work. It can seem like it takes quite a while for your motorcycle to rid itself of all its oil, but that's actually okay. It gives you a little bit of time to perform some necessary housekeeping tasks. First things first, your drain plug has some way of sealing against the oil pan. Some of you may have crush washers or perhaps like a fiber washer sealing your plug and your pan. Or in the case of our Harley, you may have a sealing O-ring. So I've already removed our old O-ring and I'm just going to install this new one. What this is going to do is help keep leaks at bay. When you consider how inexpensive these O-rings are, it really would be a shame to wind up smoking a motor because you had a leaky one and you lost all your oil. Next up is your filter. So if you've cleaned your motorcycle off correctly, you'll notice that there's very little oil actually on the part of the engine the motorcycle filter seals to. Well, rubber, being kind of catchy, can have a tendency to grab and tear. So what I like to do is grab a fingerful of my new motor oil, dab a little on the O-ring, and then just sort of work it around. And this will help the O-ring slip and slide between the filter and the block itself. It'll keep this thing from tearing. One of the other things you can do too is if you have a canister style filter that faces upward, you can actually fill this thing up with oil. What that does is minimizes the amount of time your engine is running dry without oil going to it. It can save a little bit of wear and tear. Cold starts are hard on an engine. Now that we've got some of these basic housekeeping measures done, we can take these items back over the bike and get them installed. So we now have our new oil filter prepped and it's now time to install on the bike. A couple items of note before we get to that. First things first, you want to check the motorcycle's filter sealing surface. That's important because the O-ring that we just lubricated sometimes can hang with the motorcycle rather than coming off with the filter. If you install a new filter on top of that old O-ring, you're guaranteed to have some leaks. So as you can see here, we'll throw the light up in here so we can see a little bit better, and this sealing surface is completely free and clean. I've also gone ahead and wiped this thing off. The other thing you want to think about too is as far as installation is concerned, even though you may see on some filters they do have a method to get a tool on there, that's only for removal. You should be able to install a canister style filter on your motorcycle by hand. What you're going to want to do is screw it on by hand until you feel the sealing surface touch the motorcycle, and from that point you're going to tighten somewhere between 3/4 and one more turn beyond it. That'll get the filter snug enough that it's not going to come off while you're riding. Let's get to it. So you can see here I'm threading the filter in here, and I've just got it onto the threads. I'm giving it a little spin, and now I've got the threads engaged and I can run it down by hand. As of right now, I can actually feel this thing touching the bike. So I know I have 3/4 to one turn left. One of the things I've done is gone ahead and made a little mark, which you might not be able to see on the filter, but it's an indexing mark, and it'll let me see quickly how far I have to turn to get that 3/4 to one turn. And that little bit there should be all we need. We're set to go. Let's get some oil into this motorcycle. Alrighty, our oil is down to a very, very slow drip, so it's now time to reinstall our drain plug. We've got a fresh O-ring on here. Before we begin, there's a couple things you want to think about. Firstly, on this particular bike, Harley specs a torque of 84 to 108 inch-pounds to crank down this oil drain plug bolt. I am not going to use a torque wrench here. This is a real-world oil change. Most of you are not going to break out the torque wrench in order to simply change your oil, and I don't expect you to here either. I've done a lot of these and I feel pretty confident that I can get this thing snug enough that it's not going to go anywhere, but not so tight that I'm going to crack anything. The other thing you want to consider too is when you're installing this puppy, install it with your fingers first. The reason being, if you are cross-threaded or it's not quite it's hanging up a little bit there, your fingers will feel the difference and not damage anything. If you apply a tool to this immediately and start cranking down, there's a very realistic possibility that you could destroy some thread somewhere. Let's get this puppy in there. As you can see, I'm having a little trouble getting it in there, but then once the threads catch, I can finger thread that in there without any risk of damage to any of the parts that I'm currently working with. So we'll get this threaded in by hand as far as we can, and at this point, it's probably about time to get a tool out in order to tighten this. I'm tightening up, and at this point, I'm going to give the final snug with a wrench so I have a little better feel on it. There we go. Not loose, not too tight. Should be set to go. Let's go back up to the top side of the bike. So now we're on the home stretch. Our filter's been installed, our drain plug has as well. All we have left to do is fill this thing up with some oil. Harley specs 4 quarts on this bike, and that's what we're going to add to it. I'm finishing up adding right now. So while that finishes draining, I'd like to take this moment to remind you that this is not the end of the oil change. This should end exactly as it began, with a check of the oil. Even though 4 quarts is about the right amount for this, we want to visually confirm that. So what we're going to do when this is done draining is start this motorcycle to allow the oil to circulate throughout the engine and fill in some of the air gaps we've now created, and then recheck. Theoretically, things should be spot on, and that should get us exactly where we need to be to get this bike ready to ride. That's the RevZilla way of changing oil. Hopefully those of you who are rookies learned a little something and you feel confident attacking this job. And also, maybe you old hands happen to learn a trick or two that might make your next oil change a little bit easier. All that having been said, I'm Lemmy, and I'm out of here.